Good morning, and thank you, Chair. Thanks to the organizer of this very interesting workshop, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here just for this very short presentation. I'm briefly introduce myself. I'm Paolo Veneri. I work at the OECD in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. So our research, actually our activities focus a lot on all the information, the analysis, and the policy analysis on cities, but also other types of areas, of course. And so I will talk about some of the work that we do in terms of data, in terms of definitions, and I will bring the perspective here from the OECD, which is the perspective of the user of this data, actually, and which also reflects a little bit the demand of data, of information, of evidence by countries, by the policymakers. So, so that's why we are living in a world now that is very rich of data. So what we really need from the perspective I was talking about a moment ago is tools, is methods, standards, definitions to be able to use this data and to have concrete applications that can be of help for policymakers. Now, the perspective I'm giving is really broad, and it's the perspective, as I said, of user and also the perspective of international comparison. So how we can use some very practical and concrete examples of how we can use this information which is available now, today, this data, different types of data, methods, etc., to build up evidence on cities, in this case, definitions, tools, and standards. So three things I will mention. The first thing is what we define by city. So together with the European Commission, we developed some years ago a definition of cities that we call also functional urban areas, and this is really a data-driven, of course, project, and it relies on data which is based on machine learning, Earth observation, census data, a combination of different sources of information to reach standards, to agree, and to be able to compare cities all across the world, in this case, across OECD countries. Then a few words also, what type of, once we define what a city is, how do we build some evidence and some knowledge? What can we measure? What we have done so far and what we can do in the future? Of course, this is a field in which we can advance very fast. And so, let me just begin with the reason of the definition of cities. This is a slide that actually we have been showing since long. You might have seen if you saw OECD presentations on cities. It provides the rationale of why we need to define what a city is. So if you want to do and compare cities across countries, we need to take some of the data. So take, for example, the values of population, to rank cities just in terms of population, for example. If we take municipalities in each country, and this slide shows on the left Paris, on the right Rome, and the municipality, the border of municipalities the boundaries are the dotted red line that you see in each of the two panels, but the red space is actually the square kilometers that are highly densely populated. That means that we consider it as urban, as really the physical city, not even the economic definition of cities, which is much wider, but just really the place which is contiguous, urbanized, and high density. And you can see that in the case of Paris, the municipal borders are really don't tell us anything, basically. Don't tell us absolutely anything, because they only include really the central part of Paris, and even the built environment is much wider. In the case of Rome, the situation is already different, because it's much wider. Still not enough to include the entire economic definition of cities, of course, but I mean, if we compare the two, we are going to have lots of biases in terms of international comparison. So, but this red space actually is what we use for the first step to understand where the city ends, basically. So we need a definition of cities to answer very simple questions, to be able to compare basically whether a city is bigger or smaller of another, to be able to understand the urban system of a country, to see how the urban population is distributed, the extent of primacy, for example, the extent of polycentricity across countries, to make international comparison, but to also inform policy. And also to, for example, investigate something very useful, that is how a city grows. How a city grows, for example. Does it grow in the center? Does it grow in the periphery? No? Does it grow through a suburbanization pattern that slowly becomes denser and denser and it increases, or there are sometimes reverse patterns that we can observe? In order to be able to compare it across countries, we need a city definition. So basically, this red space comes from a grid, a population grid, which is now, the one we use actually is now developed by the European Commission, and it's developed by putting together census data, a very traditional source of information, with basically satellite information, and through a process of machine learning, they are able to actually allocate population in each square kilometer of the entire world. So we are able now to apply this definition actually on a global scale, is what we are doing now actually. So then, on the basis of this physical definition of cities, we went, some years ago, we developed this definition of functional urban areas. Actually, as I said before, in this rich environment, rich ecosystem of data, we need to be able to interpret. As was said by Professor Camagni before, we need theory to interpret, and we need, in general, concepts to better interpret what data tell us, because data are so rich, and we have such an amount of information that if you want to compare, for example, cities, we have to ask ourselves, what is the definition we should give to cities? Should we give us just a physical space, so that we use the red space that I just highlighted, or should we use an economic definition of cities? So being an economist and in general working at the OECD, it's very useful to have an economic definition of cities. And so that we consider what we call urban center, which is the red part, really the physical part of the city, the high density populated, but we have to consider an area of influence, of minimal area of influence, which reflects the daily movement of people actually. So at least the space where people move every day, the space encompassed by people who work, for example, and live and move every day for several reasons. We did that by adding to this core, this urban space, actually the concept of commuting zone, so a wider space. And actually we run this method through basically all OECD countries. And we are now in the process actually of trying to apply it also outside OECD countries in places where we don't have the commuting flows data. And so there we will have to innovate a little bit and to find ways to, with other types of information, to do that. This is just an example of the results that can be found in France, where we have 83 functional urban areas, so 83 economic definition of cities of at least 50,000 people. And you observe that the darker blue is the central part, the municipalities actually that are covered in large part by the highly densely populated areas, and outside there is the lower density populated areas, which is connected to the city. So, yes, so just to show that with this definition we can provide information, analysis, like for example the population growth patterns in the center and in the periphery, so how urban growth take place, whether in the core, in the center, or in the commuting zone. And we can, in general, we develop over time a database. So this is really a tool that we can use, you can find it online to download indicators at this scale. You can compare basically several indicators, for example, air quality in cities all across OECD countries. Again, we are applying that also at a global scale. This is a web tool that you can use if you want, because data should be open, transparent, etc. So data can be downloaded here, and the metadata, you can find it online. I hope this stimulates the discussion on this topic. Thanks.
Thank you.